Well, welcome back to the Seriously Don't Do That podcast. It's been a while since we've talked, so I'm very, very excited today to have I'll say a good new friend of mine. We've not been friends for quite a long time, but Franklin is going to present to us today a very, very different perspective than what you're used to. As you know, we talk at my company, Greater Gain Group, a lot about entry into the U.S. market. And in talking with Franklin, he's actually an expert on entering the Latin American market. And I thought, based on some conversations that I've had with some of our listeners, as well as customers that we have at Greater Gain Group, that it would be important to bring him in and get his perspective on the market. We're, like I said, very fortunate to have him today. His experience is certainly very, very, very deep in the market. He's been in 25 years of commercial leadership across both LATAM and the Caribbean. We may even, if we have time, we might have a little conversation about what it's like to have experience in the Caribbean. That's a whole nother question, but we may get to that in a minute. But he's worked at some very, very familiar names to those of you that are in the health science or healthcare space: Medtronic, Edwards Lifesciences, Abbott, in cardiovascular, vascular, structural heart area. He's actually a native of Puerto Rico, Midwest educated, military background, and a decade plus actually living in Colombia. And he now leads his own company, LATAM MedTech Growth Partners, where he helps both U.S. and European MedTech companies actually generate revenue in LATAM. So, Franklin, welcome to Seriously Don't Do That.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate the invitation and the kind introduction. I'm happy to be here and share my experience about Latin America in your forum.
Well, certainly glad to have you, because we're all about growth. And I think Latin America is a market that is very underserved, as we will talk about today. But, you've spent 25 plus years building commercial infrastructure across Latin America at Medtronic, Abbott, and Edwards. What's the single biggest mistake you see MedTech founders make in their first 90 days of LATAM expansion?
I think the big mistake is to think that the region is one country and to develop a strategy, a homogeneous strategy across the board. And Latin America is a collection of different countries with different regulatory pathway, different KOL culture, and so forth. So it has to be treated independently. In summary, when I started working in Latin America, I would hear, well, if it works in Mexico, it should work here. Or if it works in Brazil, it should work in Colombia. And that is not the case. The different dynamics, different corporate, commercial culture. And someone to be successful in Latin America has to be quickly to adapt to those different realities in each country. But the reward is really big if you can master that approach.
Yeah, it's interesting, frankly, because we kind of say the same thing even about people entering the U.S. market, because depending on the region, it does kind of behave like a different country. And I would say in the U.S. market, even the language varies. I know you had mentioned Brazil and Colombia. I am not a native Spanish speaker. I speak, very little Spanish, but if you're in Brazil, it's Portuguese, right? So I mean, there's some language differences there. What when they're starting to look at that market and they make that mistake of, let me ask you this: are there certain markets in LATAM that are better than others, and why?
Well, you have, yes, they are. It's like every market, you have early adopters and late adopters. So that phenomenon, it kind of happens with the country, but I think the major factor is the regulatory path. You can get commercialized in one country faster than the other just because of the regulatory path. And that's why when you develop a strategy for Latin America, you need to consider that regulatory path and then work the other two channels accordingly.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's probably a kind of a natural progression into talking about your framework, we jokingly said, well, it's not really a joke because every good consultant has a framework, right? And I
Yes.
think you have your 3 parallel channels framework. And so I'm curious why many companies still treat like distributor alignment, physician adoption, and payer access as sequential steps. And maybe let's just back up. Could you talk a little bit about your 3 channels framework? And then I'll do some follow-up questions.
I think one of the mistakes tying that in with what are one of the most common mistakes is that you have 3 channels to operate under, and most companies do it sequentially. They will work one channel first. They'll talk to the physicians, the KOL. They'll get a distributor, but then they'll leave the regulatory path as a last step. And the companies that are successful in Latin America, they work the 3 channels parallel. So you don't have, because otherwise you're looking at 18 months to get successfully your product into a country. While if you work the 3 channels parallel, you can probably achieve that, depending on the country, of course, between 6 to 8 months rather than 2 years. And I think that's to add to the channels, the distribution channel is one of the most important because they are your strategic partner. And usually what happens is companies hire a distributor and then they have quarterly meetings and call me if you need me. You need to be on the field. You need to be a strategic partner with the distributor and bring the KOLs to the board and work the regulatory path so the distributor can have a successful penetration in the market.
So when you talk about like distributor alignment, that's specifically what you're talking about there, is just making sure that you're aligned on kind of what that go-to-market is.
But most companies think that just hiring the distributor is all you need to do.
Right. What are some other practical things that they can do? I mean, you mentioned a couple there that are more of kind of the setup, but is there some other practical things that they can do in aligning with the distributor?
Yes, in the case of MedTech, having a solid clinical and sales structure is key. And I would say in the MedTech, clinical specialists are the backbone of having positive clinical results, and that translates into a direct impact into the patient population of that country. Okay. So it's a
yeah, no, that makes sense, and I think so making sure that you've got clinical specialists that can be a resource for your distributors is a key piece. On your channel 2, which is like physician adoption, what does that work look like? And then maybe a follow-up on that, who should own that? Should that be on the company side or the distributor side?
That's a great question, Dan. It has to be a joint effort. It has to be a partnership between the distributor and the company that is getting into the market. Why? Because the company brings the expertise, right? The technology and the products that want to be commercialized in the country. The distributor brings a network, brings a know-how on how the company operates, and with those making a formula with those 2 elements equals to success. If you leave the distributor without any support, just thinking that he has the entire picture or infrastructure without the know-how, it's set to fail. And it's frustrating, right? Because at the end of the day, it's all a partnership. It's a partnership with the distributor. It's a partnership with the KOLs. And it's a partnership with the regulatory agencies in the country. And that's what brings all together.
So one of the things that surprised me when I was kind of looking at your channels was you talking about payer access. I think in my experience in bringing, working with either U.S. based companies or companies that are coming to the U.S. market, the payer market is probably the most misunderstood because of the differences between, say, a single payer system, which a lot of the European, Canada, Australia, there's a number of countries that have single payer, and they come to the U.S. and it's a multi-payer system, right? And you've got a lot of private insurance. I honestly would have just assumed that Latin America was mostly single payer, but that would be. Could you share a little bit about maybe kind of what that looks like, what the payer landscape looks like, and realizing that's different from country to country, but overall what that looks like?
No, but that's a great question, and I have a couple of excellent examples depending on the country. But the payer channel overall in every country, well, you got to get into their formulary system, right? So that's why it's important to be running that from the very beginning and not leaving that to the end. Having said that, depending on the country, the payer behaves also like a GPO or a group purchasing organization in the US, meaning that depending on the technology and the therapies, you could sell directly to them. They become a customer. And that's an interesting dynamic. Let's take, for example, Brazil. Brazil is 250 million people, right, in the country, but there's 65 million with private medical insurance. So you need, when you approach Latin America, every country has a slightly different setup. So if you're going after the private sector, there you go with 65 million patients versus the public sector, which is the remaining of the country. Chile, for example, is a single payer because the sale of copper to China is what supports the healthcare system of the country, for instance. But Colombia has a very diverse private sector, public sector, just like the US, like say Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. So depending on the country, you need to work accordingly. A great example in Brazil, which, coming from the US at the beginning of my career in Latin America was kind of shocking, was that the payers would tell the patient, I will pay for the procedure, but you have to pay for the medical device. So having said that, patients get very creative. And I had two examples where the patient sold their car for X amount so they could buy the medical device needed for their procedures. So you don't see that in the States.
Right.
But you see that flexibility and that understanding between the healthcare system of the country and the patient population. Those are just interesting example. On the other hand, for example, in Colombia, for 15 years, they had what they called the tutela system. And the tutela system meant that if the payer refused or turned down paying for a medical device, the patients had the right to appeal in a healthcare court of law. And what happened is at some point they eliminated that because 90% of the time they would win the appeal. So those are some of the mechanisms that work in different countries. And that's why you can take a cookie cutter approach to the entire region, which is slightly different to your comment about the US, right? You have regional differences, but overall it's a very homogeneous system in the US.
Yeah,
right?
From a insurance standpoint, the system is pretty consistent, from state to state. It all depends on what area you're operating in. I thought it was interesting in our conversation where you made the case about Puerto Rico being the most underused entry point in Latin America. So for somebody like me that's hearing that for the first time, what does like a 90-day Puerto Rico playbook actually look? Well, let's even back up a step. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why it's a great entry point, and then maybe give a couple of things that would be good if somebody's thinking about looking towards Puerto Rico, some things they need to be thinking about, to get there for the first 90 days.
So Puerto Rico is a great entry point because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, but it's a Latin American country as far as culture and mechanism of action. So what you get with Puerto Rico is Puerto Rico has a 3 million people. It's a 3 million people island. U.S. citizens, Latin American background. It has FDA. So the benefit of using Puerto Rico as an entry port to Latin America is that it's a good test ground for your technologies and your system, because you don't have to go through the regulatory path. You can jump right into the market dynamics, the customer culture, which is very similar to Latin America. You can get that experience and learning curve in Puerto Rico with a small sample of 3 million possible patients, and then replicate that at a larger scale in Latin America. Because, for example, Colombia is a country of 50 million people. Brazil is 250. So Puerto Rico affords you the luxury of making mistakes and correcting them without a high ticket cost, versus trying to get into a 50 million people market and making mistakes that can be very costly. So that's one of the benefits of going into the Puerto Rico market as an entry port to Latin America.
So if somebody were to say, okay, I'm interested in that, what would where would they start with that? I mean, obviously they could start with you, Franklin, because I'm sure you could help them. But are there certain things that they need to, have prepared to enter through that market? Is there certain types of, registrations and things they need to do to come in through the Puerto Rican market? We
need to establish a legal entity, but we don't really need to open an office. And so we can we can establish a legal entity in the country. And then the second step would be to find a 3PL coordinator for the inventories and so forth. So you don't need to open an office. You don't need to have a warehouse. You don't need all those logistics can be subcontract in Puerto Rico. And for many years under the tax exemption incentive in the island, the island is well positioned to welcome any company to do business in Puerto Rico. So the infrastructure is solid, and it's very similar to the U.S., which is one advantage also for U.S. companies.
Yeah. I want to I'm assuming that most of our listeners will know what a 3PL is, but could you just describe what a 3PL is?
Yes, it's a third-party logistic coordinator. So sometimes 3PLs are distributors that offer that service. So we'll manage your inventory in the island, and that's a 3PL. They manage every logistic necessary for you to get commercialized in the island.
Excellent. So one of the things you said when we talked here in the last couple of weeks was that the biggest barrier to entering Latin America is a 30-year-old perception that no longer exists. What specifically do U.S. founders get wrong about the region, and what's the reality on the ground today?
That's one of those questions that for some reason persists decade after decade. I'll tell you a funny story. When I first told my parents that I was moving to Colombia, the first thing that came to mind is that I was going to get kidnapped and they would be paying the ransom. And that's far from it. It was reality 25, 30 years ago. The countries in Latin America have a strong middle class that keeps growing. The infrastructure is solid. And what is interesting, a lot of U.S. companies started to move their shared services to South America. So for me, that reflects that times have changed and that you have a solid political system in place and infrastructure to accommodate any commercial needs for any company that wants to go into the USA. I have to add that the Europeans and the Asians have a leg up on getting into the Latin American market. So we need to motivate U.S. companies that we're leaving money on the table by not going after these countries that are neighbors. In other words.
That's a really good point. So, Franklin, if we've got, let's say we have a founder that's listening to us today, and they're starting to think about the Latin American market here, maybe in the next year, late 2026 or 2027. What are the things that they can start doing like right now to get ready for that?
For the first thing is to determine what countries they want to get into. Okay, because there are a lot of countries, and my recommendation to U.S. companies that want to get into the Latin America market is to build a 3-year plan. And then in that 3-year plan, we'll pinpoint what countries, depending on the regulatory path and the physician culture, we then do a strategic plan to say, for example, and we mentioned this before, I'm working on a project right now where I'm saying, let's get into the Puerto Rican market, but at the same time, let's start the regulatory path in Colombia. So by the time you get the experience in Puerto Rico, you already have the regulatory path, the distributor pinpoint, and the reimbursement part already lined up. And that would take a year. So I think what we're used to sometimes in the state is to go one step at a time. Latin America breaks that rule. Latin America is about having the vision and the strategy to do three things at the same time. So that would be my recommendation: is pinpoint the for example, the 3 countries of big interest where your products and therapies have a real need in that country, and then develop the right strategy for each country and work them simultaneously.
Well, I think probably the most important thing is to engage somebody like you, Franklin, that can help them, right?
Wow, it's kind. Thank you. No,
yeah,
I learned a lot in Latin America, and I had to change my chip from 20 years working in New York City to this continuous changing, what do you call it, system sometimes, right? Like, I'm going to give you an example. Right now, keeping an eye on the Colombian presidential elections, because that's going to determine how quickly I can get, if you have a conservative versus a liberal, how quickly I can get through all the elements that I mentioned in the country. So that's another thing that you gotta keep an eye on. Having said that, then the Latin American market it's like a chess game, right? If you learn how to play or how to move every piece on the board, that's how I look at Latin America. You're going to be very successful. And that's my approach to the market.
No, that's a good point. And I think some of the other things that I kind of would pick out of that you talked about was, obviously Puerto Rico as an entry point, having a 3-year strategy. I think sometimes people have a 3-month or 6-month strategy. I think it's important, thinking about your 3 pillars of what they need, which would include, distributors, physicians, and payers. And then, like I said, you didn't say it, but I'll say it. Having somebody that's been there and done that can be super helpful. And certainly been very fortunate to have you join us today. What's the best way, if you've got folks listening and they want to hear a little bit more about what you do, where's the best place to get in touch with you?
My LinkedIn is one. You can contact me directly also, and we can leave my information. Yeah,
we'll put your email and your LinkedIn in the notes for the podcast, or whatever platform that our listeners might be listening on. You can look for that in the notes, and we get you connected. I would just tell you, if you're thinking about the Latin American market, it may not be time to engage Franklin, but at least have a conversation with him, because you're going to learn things that you don't know, and you can prepare. Because I know sometimes these things take a little bit of time, but would encourage our audience to reach out to him. And if you're thinking about entering the U.S. market, reach out to us. We're always glad to talk to you, and we're always glad to have you listening to the Seriously Don't Do That podcast. Franklin, thank you so much for being a guest today. This has been super helpful, and we'll look forward to hopefully talking with you again soon.
Thank you, Dan. I always enjoy our time together, and I appreciate the opportunity to address this important subject.
Perfect. Well, Franklin, thanks again. Thank you all for listening. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon here on the Seriously Don't Do That podcast.
Bye now. Thanks.